What is the craziest war tactic used in history? During World War II, U.S. submarine commanders were generally only allowed 4 war patrols out of fear that they would either become too ambitious or too cautious after too many patrols. However, Commander Eugene Lucky Flucky of the USS Barb begged for and was granted a 5th war patrol. He then immediately asked that rocket launchers be fitted to the Barb. Already famous for his tactic of maximum harassment, Flucky became the first submarine commander to fire rockets at shore targets, but he didn't stop there, noticing a supply train on one of the shores he watched. Unable to use his rockets on it, Flucky sent 8 of his sailors ashore to rig a bomb under the tracks. As the landing party returned to the Barb, the train set off the bomb and was launched 200 feet into the air. This was the only time Allied forces landed on the Japanese home islands during World War II and the only known time a submarine has sank a train. Flucky was a wild man though. On his way back to port without any torpedoes left, he was one sunk ship away from winning a bet, so he rammed the Barb right into it. I can't believe no one has mentioned this yet, but Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British Navy was having a hell of a time getting into an engagement with the French Navy. Then one day, the French finally committed to a battle after sailing out of a Spanish port, with the Spanish Navy at their sides. The total battle line was 27 British ships against 33 ships of the combined French and Spanish navies. The Allied fleet formed a huge defensive line and invited Nelson to try to attack it. "Come at me, bro." Now when talking about naval engagements, you'll often hear of the term crossing the T. It was general tactical knowledge at the time that your best bet for winning a naval engagement was to cross the other party's T, basically allowing your own ships to give a maximum broadside to the front ships of your enemy's line formation. Attacking as a line into the teeth of a bunch of broadsides was considered suicidal. But good old Nelson was convinced of the superiority of the British Navy over every other navy in the world, and he was honor-bound to prove that shit. So what did Nelson do? He yelled YOLO and, after dividing his command into 2 line formations, fucking charged his ships straight at the Allied defense, thus crossing his own T, with his own ship, the HMS Victory, leading one of his 2 lines. His ship and the other lead British ship took terrible hits, but they reached and broke through the French and Spanish line. But get this, when his 2 lines broke through, they kept right on sailing, which cut the French and Spanish Navy into 3 parts, in between his own 2 lines. Suddenly, the French and Spanish navies were having their own T's crossed, with British ships firing all guns and giving full broadsides in both directions as they sailed right on through to the other side. As the smoke finally started to settle, 22 ships of the Spanish and French navies were destroyed. Not a single British ship was lost that day. Nelson, who died later that day from a bullet wound, and the British Navy sailed into history that day as eternal badasses. In North Africa, the British put fake maps in a jeep. It was driven by an English officer who had been giving secrets to his belly-dancing Egyptian lover, who passed them on to the Egyptian Brotherhood, who in turn passed them on to the Nazis. The British found him out, and decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. They put the maps in the glove compartment, and instructed him to drive a certain direction. A bomb planted in the jeep by the British killed him, and drew the Germans' attention. They found the maps, which indicated smooth driving at a certain narrow pass, which was actually sandy. The German tanks got stuck, and were decimated by the British artillery hidden nearby. The book Bodyguard of Lies is one of the most fascinating war books I've ever read. The British in World War II were amazing at deception. What we think of as war is really about logistics and projecting power. Getting people and goods to where they need to be is the most important aspect of a war. Everything else is just a series of inconsequential battles if you cannot project power and sustain momentum. To that end, getting food to the troops is paramount. An army marches on its stomach. To that end, one of the craziest tactics was done by Catherine the Great of Russia against the Ottomans. To feed the army, Catherine would issue bills of exchange to Ottoman peasants to pay for grain, the assignat. This was a future promise to pay the bills. The Ottomans had a fixed price for grain, which was the price ceiling that nobody was allowed to sell above. This was paid in gold, which would have been too heavy to carry around and likely would have been stolen by Russian generals. When her army invaded, it was fed by paying above market rates of the Ottomans' own grain using these assignats. This also deprived the Ottoman troops of bread, and thousands of troops deserted or revolted. What backed these assignats if they were not backed by gold? They were backed by the promise of conquered land, that the Ottoman peasants were working for the Sultan. Catherine bought Ottoman bread by paying above market rates, backed by the land she intended to conquer. To put it in context, you show up with a gun to rob a bank and bribe the security guard with the money you are intending to steal. In the War of 1812, the British/Canadians were trying to take Detroit but were severely outnumbered. They only had a couple hundred British soldiers, and a few hundred militia and native warriors. They couldn't wait because another American force was on the way. So as they set up camp across the river, they dug trenches, and would march by in full view of the Americans, then duck into the trench and sneak back to march by again. At night they would light extra fires, and at dinner time they would do the same trench trick, the same guys repeatedly lining up to get pretend food. They also gave extra British uniforms to the Canadian militiamen so it looked like there were thousands of British soldiers. The Americans had men but not the supplies or morale to endure a siege against an apparently superior British force. So they surrendered the fort without a fight. Persian general was stuck besieging a city whose walls were impenetrable. So, unbeknownst to him, one of his high commanders cuts off his own nose and one of his ears. He then goes before the general, who is a bit disturbed, asking why his commander would do this. The commander says that it is part of his plan, and he knew that the general wouldn't be on board with it if he asked first. The commander then informs the general that he will go before the king of the enemy city, and claim that the general did this to him, and that he would like to betray said general for this mutilation. The commander then told the general to send his weakest men to a specific place so that the commander, leading the enemy forces, could win a major victory, solidifying his place with the enemy city. The commander would then take over watch of one of the gates, and simply let in the general's army. Save for a few hiccups, it worked and the city was destroyed. Julius Caesar's plan at the Battle of Alesia is so bizarre, can't believe the dude actually pulled off this strategy. During the final act of the war in Gaul, the Romans had the Gauls' army and their chieftain Vercingetorix trapped in the town of Alesia. Instead of assaulting the city, Caesar decided to go ahead with a classic siege to starve the enemy. He then decided that a normal siege wasn't enough, so he had his army build a 10 meters high wall with watchtowers around the entire city. Perfect plan, right? No one can get out, the city is fenced in low. Unfortunately, words got out to a second Gaul army that Vercingetorix and his troops were in trouble in Alesia. This army was heading straight for Alesia and was threatening to break the Roman siege. So Julius Caesar had another wild idea: let's build a second wall around our Roman army and the first wall, so we can block the incoming Gaul army and keep the Alesia siege going. Woot woot. Roman soldiers built that second high wall again in record time, and the Gaul army that was supposed to save Alesia was instead welcomed by insane fortifications. They tried pushing through, but the Roman defeated them thanks to Caesar's super wall. Vercingetorix and his soldiers also tried to break the wall, couldn't do it. He surrendered to the Romans and Gaul was finally conquered. Literally catapulting plague corpses over walls. How the plague spread to Italy? In 1334, an epidemic which would eventually kill 2/3 of China's inhabitants struck the northeastern Chinese province of Hebei, claiming up to 90% of the population, some 5 million people. Carried along trade routes, the Black Death, as it would soon be called, began to work its way west, striking India, Syria, and Mesopotamia. In 1346, the plague came to Kaffa, a Genoese cathedral city and a port central to the successful Genoese trade industry located on the Crimean peninsula of the Black Sea. The Tartar forces of Kipchak Khan Janibeg, backed by Venetian forces, competitors of the Genoese, had laid siege to Kaffa in hopes of removing the Genoese from one of the cornerstones of Europe's defense against Eastern attack and Genoa's dominance of East-West trade. Kaffa was helpless, barely able to sustain even the crudest living conditions. Finding its chief means of supplies cut off, Kaffa spent the next year watching itself decline into a hopeless state. But then, in 1347, to the Italians' delight, their opponents began to die off at an alarming rate. Janibeg's army was overcome by the plague. Janibeg had no choice but to call off his siege, but not until he performed one last act of warfare against Genoa. Using the catapults designed to throw boulders and fireballs over the walls of fortified cities like Kaffa, Janibeg launched the plague-infested corpses of his dead men into the city. The Italians quickly dumped these bodies back into the sea, but the damage was done. Due to the squalid conditions forced upon Kaffa by the siege, it was ripe for the quick desolation of the plague. Hoping to escape the quickly spreading disease, 4 Genoese ships, thought to be untainted, departed from Kaffa. They sailed home to Italy.